Hello. Last week, I invited you to join me in the great conversation about great books education. And today I would like to invite you to continue that conversation with me. However, whereas last week we spoke almost entirely about the great books of Western civilization and just mentioned that there were other lists for books of other civilizations, today I would like to flip that around and talk mainly about books from other civilizations, not just talk about them, but show them to you. There are many of them up here. Many people have asked for a tour of my library, so I would like to show you some books that I have in my library from other civilizations. So I will put timestamps, as always, at the bottom of my video in the description. And the things I will talk about today, well, I'm obviously into the introduction already. Then I want to talk about some things related to perhaps supplementing or updating this collection behind me. Then I want to talk about using the Syntopicon, a book that I mentioned last time but didn't go into detail the way I wanted to. Then we will move on to talk about the difficulty of defining and delineating civilizations and saying what belongs where. And then we will talk about civilizations, books from civilizations from East Asia, from India, and from Islamic civilization. Let's call it that for the moment. And then we'll just conclude with a consideration of how relatively difficult it is to do great books from these other civilizations compared to doing great books from Western civilization. So, if you are just joining in this video, you didn't see the previous one, just to summarize very briefly, great books education is a concept that says, and the great conversation is an idea that says that there's a thread of ideas, connecting chain of ideas throughout the history of a civilization that's encapsulated and captured in the most important literary and philosophical and scientific works, and that the people of one generation don't work in a vacuum. They read the books from previous generations and build upon them. And so there's a chain, a thread that is sort of conversational in that sense, the authors of one generation building on the ideas of a previous generation. And then in great books education is a concept that's been around for about 100 years now that says that it's worthwhile for young minds in particular to begin wrestling with these ideas, not just as they are presented in secondary sources or by a professor in a lecture, but by reading the text. Maybe not in the original language, in translation into English, but not in a summary form, not in some sort of secondary or abridged version, but in the full-fledged, real original text in which these ideas come from. So these are ideas that form the backbone of the belief system and the social structure of a civilization. And so reading books like this is very difficult, but it is worthwhile. And because it's so difficult, that's another part of the conversation. It's always been thought that you don't want to do this in a vacuum by yourself. You want to do this and then do it in a discussion group. So when this is encapsulated in schools, in colleges, in core curriculums and the like, it's always done around a seminar table. And then we talked at length last time about this particular collection, University of Chicago Encyclopedia Britannica collection of the great books of the West, compiled by Mortimer Adler and other professors at the University of Chicago. In 1952, this was published. And the idea here being that this is a lifelong project. To read all 54 volumes of this might take you 10 years, but you just don't just read it once and say you're done. The idea is that you do this several times throughout your life, and each time you do it, you see it with more connections and more richness and more insight. So that's the idea of great books education for the lifelong learning as part of what we can call the classical education, liberal education. And because this comes out of America, American colleges, started at Columbia University and moved to the University of Chicago and spread to other colleges. And the United States is an offspring of Europe, Western culture, European culture. This is where these ideas come from. The idea is getting at the foundation of your civilization. So great books education has generally meant almost exclusively, not necessarily this collection, but the West, great books of the West, great books of the European tradition. But people have always known that there are other traditions that also have very long and very rich literary and philosophical and scientific traditions. And so there are great books traditions from other civilizations too that we will talk about later this evening. However, first, I want to move on and talk about some of the things that I mentioned that I wish I had said last time, but that would have made that video too long. Perhaps this video will be long. Now, and the first of these is the whole idea of supplementing or updating this collection. And that starts over here. I tried to have this in the video last time. This little 10-volume set over here is a supplement called the Gateway to the Great Books. And this came out in 1962. And this was a recognition that basically, yes, reading these books is very hard. They contain complex ideas, complicated arguments. It's rich, it's worthwhile, it's intellectually engaging, but it's difficult. And reading this kind of book is also something that's an acquired task, an acquired taste, an acquired ability. And these authors made the decision that they didn't just want to give you excerpts from these books, they wanted to give you relatively full works. So reading Darwin wrote several major books, but his two main books are The Origin of Species and The Descent of Man. You get both of these in here. With Plato and Aristotle, you don't necessarily get everything they wrote, but you get most of it. And so what you're going to do when you try to read one of these books, read one of these authors, you get very much involved in one of these authors. And if his particular style is difficult, particularly opaque to you, you can really kind of feel like you're bogging down, even if you are in a discussion group that will help you. So what this Gateway to the Great Books did is said, well, let's sort of do something different. Let's give you, instead of one author at a time and a lengthy book that he wrote, let's give you things that are organized thematically. So here we have imaginative literature in volume 3 of this, and this is basically a collection of short stories from a whole bunch of different authors. So you are not reading one long work by one person and then moving on from a work of philosophy to a work of history to a work of science. You're sticking with imaginative literature. You're sticking with short stories. You're reading, they're all high quality literary stories, but you're reading different stories by different authors. And so it's easier to start to get a taste for reading high quality material if you do it in sort of shorter bites, shorter chunks. So that's what this Gateway to the Great Books is about. And so that's a supplement that you can get if that's interesting to you. And then, as I said, this edition, which I have behind me here and which I gave the link for last time, I'll give again. It is available in its entirety, free online in digitized form. The 1952 version of this was updated in 1990. And in 1990, basically what they did, in my perspective, is they kind of took a lot of the authors that they put in the Gateway to the Great Books, and instead of having this be a supplement, they made 6 additional volumes. So the 1990 version is not 54 volumes, it's 60 volumes. And the last 6 volumes are works from the 20th century. So we talked about last time the fact that this collection is absolutely not perfect. It was always open to criticism. The authors knew, just as an intellectual project, trying to say, let's choose 50 volumes that we can use as a core curriculum or as a focus for lifelong learning and repeated rereading. We're not saying we're not going to read anything else, but to have this sort of be a collection, we want to whittle it down to 50 volumes. Obviously, we're going to be leaving some things out. We're going to be putting some things in that are open to criticism and open to challenge. And so we talked about all of that last time. And I mentioned that I had various thoughts about why maybe this book was here and not another book and something would be left out. But that entire project, I don't have much of a problem with. But fundamentally, philosophically, I do have a problem with what they did adding those additional 6 volumes. And I even kind of have a problem with the fact that Freud and William James are here at the time when they were put in. To call this the Western tradition and to say that these are the classics and that these have been discussed over the centuries, I think you need to let at least a century go by. I don't think you can put in things from your own century. I don't think you can put in things that, however important they might seem at the moment, could just be trendy at the moment, could just be current. You have no way of knowing if people 100 years from now, 200 years from now are going to still be reading and talking about some of these people. Fate and fortune are fickle in these ways. Aristotle's forgotten for centuries and then found again, so he's obviously very important. And somebody like Bach also was forgotten for about 100 years and then came back. So you can't know, you can't say for sure if somebody's going to be part of the ongoing conversation. But to just take people who are still alive or current and put them in, I kind of have real problems with that. And then still, I mean, that might be a good anthology and collection like this is over here, but to call that part of the great books tradition, the great books of the Western world, that I don't know. And then secondly, I still prefer the 1952 version to the 1990 version for another reason. And that is, well, the main thing is that this is available free online and everybody can access this right now. But what they also did, apart from adding these 6 volumes on, was the few things that they took some people out, they put some people in, but it was all done over in this section. It was all done in the last 500 years, mostly in the 19th century. And as I mentioned last time, my main issue with this whole collection as a representative sample of the Western tradition is that it seems really top-heavy. The last 500 years are overrepresented. The English language is overrepresented. I also kind of feel like the ancient Greeks are kind of overrepresented given how underrepresented the Romans are and the Middle Ages are. I feel like, in particular, this section here, from about the year 0 or so to about the year 1500, is incredibly skimpy compared to this 500 years now, and then with another 6 volumes going over here for the 20th century. So to call this the Western tradition, to me, if I were to be on an editorial board and to rework this, where I would want to make changes would be to put a lot more in to the Roman period and the Middle Ages in particular. I think that really, if you look at this whole collection, it's very Enlightenment influenced in sort of slighting the Middle Ages and slighting Christianity. You could really look at this collection and not be so sure that there was a dominant religion throughout most of this time, as there was. So I mentioned last time that great books education is particularly strong in Catholic universities, Christian universities, Protestant universities. They obviously, I don't think they probably use this collection. They have a similar collection, but they probably have a stronger representation of Christian theology and mysticism, things like that. One thing that they did do, I'm sure very well, in 1990, let's move on to the next topic, is they probably, I'm sure, reworked the Syntopicon. They did not just pull an author out and put another book in its place. When they tacked these on, they didn't just tack them on, they also put them in here. The Syntopicon, what is this? It's called The Great Ideas. Okay, it's a 2-volume set that comes at the beginning. And basically, this is a cross-referencing of all of the books that are in this collection according to, it's an alphabetical list of ideas. About everything about animals, angels, art, cause, change, desire, evolution, fate, God, habit. So you could take this Syntopicon, makes this collection a very valuable thing to work with. It gives you a third way of reading. One way that you can read this set, some people do, some discussion groups, is just purely, it's pretty much historical. Start with Homer, about 800 BC, and end up with Freud in the 1930s. So you could read the whole thing historically, chronologically, and progress through all the different types of ideas in the civilization at a time. Another way you can do that is probably also still basically chronologically, but also according to the different types of books. You could read all the imaginative literature, the poetry and the novels together, and then you could read all the philosophy. So you could start by reading Plato and Aristotle and then skip up to Plotinus and Augustine and Aquinas and go up to Hegel. So focusing on the philosophy or focusing on the history. The Syntopicon gives you a third way of using this whole set that you could do if you had a whole group of people and everybody had access to the whole set. You could go thematically. You could go by topic, and you could take something like habit. And you could look here and you could find there's a whole section about habit formation, the growth and decay of habits, ways of strengthening and breaking habits. So where do people talk about that? Well, Plato talks about that in his Theaetetus, page 518, A and B. Aristotle in his Categories, chapter 8, and his Ethics, book 2. Epictetus in his Discourses, Aurelius, Plotinus, Francis Bacon, Descartes. William James talks about it in Psychology. Darwin talks about it in Descent of Man, page 309. So you have a whole list of all the main ideas where this similar idea has been discussed. So as a group, you could say, let's go through habit. Let's go through these things. Let's talk next time about the habit formation. So instead of saying, well, for next time, let's read the next 50 pages of the next book, you could say, let's all go and try to read as much of this as we can, but everybody will take one author, one section, and be particularly responsible for sort of trying to understand that and lead the discussion about that next time. So you could go through this systematically and gives you a third way of using this text, which is, again, as I said, this makes this collection very, very valuable. More valuable than just a list. A list, you could take one book out and put another book in, but this here, you can't pull a book out and put another book in. You'd have to redo the Syntopicon, as I'm sure they did in 1990. So, that is for Western civilization. So, let's talk about the definitions of civilizations, the difficulty of defining civilizations, where to ascribe and put something in to a civilization's categories, where do other things fit. However you do this, you're going to step on somebody's toes. You're going to offend somebody. You're going to make somebody feel like you are leaving somebody out or doing something, slighting somebody. Same way of trying to choose 50 books and leave some authors out and put authors in. Western civilization, European civilization, European-derived civilization, I think is pretty unproblematic in defining where it is, but there are certain authors that if you go and you look at the beginning, many times people try to start the history of civilization with the Epic of Gilgamesh and then move on to the Egyptians. Okay, that's the beginning of history, but then they aren't really, for most of the time, that's not part of Western civilization. The Greeks, well, that was pan-Mediterranean civilization. And when we talk about Islamic civilization today, Islamic philosophy is based in Aristotle, as is European philosophy. So Aristotle, does he go with Western philosophy, or does he Western civilization, or does he go into Islamic civilization? The foundation there is different. So that's kind of an interesting question. And then when we come to the civilizations we're going to discuss today, there's always the question of where do we draw the boundaries? Where do we draw the lines? Where do we leave people out? So the main civilizations that have great books lists that I have looked at, that other people have looked at, are the civilizations that we can call Far Eastern civilization or East Asian civilization, which is the civilization of Korea and Japan and China, of course, mainly China. But then what about Southeast Asia? How far into that does it go? Where does it go? I guess the definition of East Asian civilization is the main literary language. The cultural language there is what we today call classical Chinese. So if it's written in classical Chinese, it's East Asian civilization. And then there's Indic Civilization, not just India, the whole Indian subcontinent, everything that comes out of there. But when we start looking and defining lines there too, Indic civilization, the religion there is Hinduism. Well, Jainism derives from that, but so does Buddhism. And Buddhism moves out of India, goes into East Asia, goes into Southeast Asia. Where does Southeast Asia go? Pali, the Pali Canon, all of that. How do we categorize that? Where do we put it? Indic civilization, the main language there is Sanskrit, but a lot of people would say, well, what about Tamil? Tamil also has a huge tradition in South India. So when people have drawn up great book civilization, mostly India, they're focusing on Sanskrit, but again, maybe they're slighting lots of people there. And then the other civilization that we can call Near Eastern or Middle Eastern civilization, Islamic civilization, because that's the really dominant religion there for the past 1,300 years, has, as I said, has very deep roots that go way, way back to ancient Sumerian and all sorts of other languages that have equal call upon Greek civilization. But the main literary languages there are Arabic and Persian. So that's what I've been able to focus on my life a little bit, at least, of these four major literary languages. That's kind of how I do it, linguistically minded person that I am. So I think of this civilization here as, well, Latin and Greek are the foundations, and then as we get into modern times, we get other languages like French and German and English and Spanish, and so defining it linguistically. This civilization is mainly classical Chinese, a little bit of Korean, a little bit of Japanese. This civilization is, all I've been able to explore is Sanskrit. I haven't gotten into the Tamil. And this civilization, for me, I focus on Arabic and Persian. So let me show you some of these books from my collection. I mentioned last time I provided the link, I'll provide it again. There is a collection that's available online, just like this collection of the great books of the West is available free online. This book collection was called the Sacred Books of the East. And it contains it's not organized systematically, chronologically like this. It's sort of a hodgepodge of over a 50-year period of collecting about 50 volumes from all of these different civilizations. So I mentioned in a couple of months' time, when I get everything organized, I will open my academy, and I'd be happy to lead great books discussions of other civilizations as well as Western civilization. I will use this canon for the West, and I will use the Sacred Books of the East for these other civilizations. But I have recourse to other volumes, and I'd like to show you some of these here. So this is East Asian civilization, and here the main language, as I said, is classical Chinese, and that makes it kind of easy to start to define the canon. The best thing I have picked up in my collection from my library is this 5-volume set called the Chinese Classics. So in Chinese civilization for millennia, you got a good career by memorizing characters, memorizing Chinese writing, memorizing entire texts of the classics. So the classic tradition was clearly defined. You have the Confucian Analects, you have the philosophy of Mencius, you have other historical books and the like. And this collection here that I have, the Chinese Classics, is just a beautiful scholarly work to work with. You have here, I will always, when I hold the pages up, I always invite you to pause the video and look at it in more detail. But you have at the top, you have the original text, and then you have the translation underneath it, and then you have footnotes that explain all sorts of things. And this is particularly for doing scriptorium. This is a wonderful volume because the Chinese characters here, the classical Chinese, is so nice and large and dark and clear. When you spend too many years learning all sorts of different scripts, your eyes start to go and you need reading glasses to see things. And in many places, texts just aren't printed. So nicely and beautifully and largely and clearly as this, with a scholarly translation underneath and all the notes that you need to understand it. So this is a marvelous set to get, but this deals with stuff that was pretty much canonized maybe about the time of 500 BC, which is about the time of Buddha, but Buddha did not get into India or get into East Asia until much later. And then a lot of the other texts that you get for classical texts of East Asian civilization do have to do with Buddhism. And so you can sometimes get books that are, because I lived in Korea for so many years, Korea was my language of focus. Sometimes you get something like, here's the Pulgyo Songjön, the teachings of Buddha. And you can get a nice version that is just in Korean on one side with an English translation on the other side. And I'm not sure who they were preparing this for. This isn't really, it doesn't have any scholarly notes or anything. And it's sold in Korea. So I don't know what the purpose of putting the English there was, but I was very happy to find that. It certainly facilitates the readings of the teachings of the Buddha. And then you also find other editions that have, because the texts are originally also in classical Chinese, you have all three languages. You have Chinese and Korean and English. So this facilitates the scholarly study of this whole tradition to a very high degree. This is also highly appreciated. And you can see, though, as I pointed out, that the Chinese is not so nice and large and clear as it is in these classical Chinese texts that I have here. So those are some texts from East Asian civilization. Let's move on, heading back towards the West again, and go to India. And if we go to India, first I'm going to show you some things that are not Indian at all. You probably recognize there's Loeb Classical Library editions. For red is for Latin, and green is for Greek. And now look at this. Perfectly matching that is this little sort of bluish book. What is this? This is the Clay Sanskrit Library. The Clay Sanskrit Library is clearly designed to be on a shelf, match itself well with the Loeb Classical Library of Latin and Greek texts. And this has now, I think, 56 different classic Sanskrit texts have been published in this edition. And this obviously makes them very accessible, and that's highly appreciated. These books, like the Loeb classical books, they don't have, as the Chinese, they don't have like footnotes. They don't have explanations. They don't have grammatical help with it, really. It's just a bilingual text, which is a nice thing to have. But while I'm grateful that this is here, they have not used either Devanagari, the main script that you always see Sanskrit in, or any other Indian script. They have transcribed the Sanskrit into Latin characters, which seems like a strange thing to me to do. Makes me not as excited to use these as if it were printed in the Devanagari script that you see published in all sorts of other Indian books. So I think the fact that you can find, for example, the 10 principal Upanishads published in its entirety, just in full Sanskrit text, no notes, nothing like this. Only the introduction and the conclusion are in English. But this just shows that there's obviously people out there that are still able to read 1,000 pages of the Upanishads, the main ancient philosophical texts of India. To get them into learning that, you also get lots of nice editions like this, one particular Upanishad, where, again, highly appreciated, as with the Chinese editions, that the Devanagari print here is so nice and large and dark. And then furthermore, this is an Indian book for an Indian audience, but it also has, not everything, but many things, word by word. So it breaks it down. It makes it easier for you to read and understand. So you have the original Sanskrit here, and then some of the probably the more difficult, the new words, and then a nice English translation of one of the Upanishads, again, the principal philosophical works of India. You also find other editions of things like this. Last time I mentioned that I like to say that I practice pranayama. Pranayama is, we mistranslate it as the science of breath, breathing. Prana is the life force that's not goes together with breath, but is not synonymous with breath. But here you have the same thing that you don't have in that here. You have, I just broke my book. You have the original text. You have the English sort of or Latin transliteration, so it's easy to read. And then you have not the individual word by word, but you have a translation and then an explanation, because these are complicated ideas about how you breathe. And Indian books, unfortunately, the publication of the pages and the binding, that kind of thing happens all too frequently. So I think the most valuable book I have for anything in learning or studying Sanskrit is this edition of the Ramopakyana, the story of Rama in the Mahabharata. India has two major epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana. The Mahabharata is roughly the Iliad. It's a war story, and the Ramayana is roughly the Odyssey. It's a story of trying to get a stolen wife back. But this is just a fantastic resource for learning and studying Sanskrit. And for every verse, you have the Sanskrit written, the original. Then you have an English or Latinized pronunciation to make it easier. Then you have parsing, the grammatical, which cases, which forms of these. Then you have a word-by-word breakdown of all the meaning. And then you have, this is really special, you have it, this is poetry here. You have it rephrased in sort of a prose-like form so that it's easier to read and understand. And then you have a translation of that. And the whole thing is also comes with audio, so you can really hear and see. It'll learn a lot of Sanskrit with this volume. I wish there were more like it. I think it's the only one. So those are some of the texts from Indian civilization. Let's move on now to what we can call Near Eastern or Middle Eastern or Islamic civilization that has two main languages, Arabic and Persian. And so to access some of the Arabic books, they don't match the nice small size format of the Clay Sanskrit Library or the Loeb Library. And they're not as extensive. I think books for both Latin and Greek in the Loeb Library. As I said, I think there's 56 for the Clay. There is the Islamic Translation Series published by Brigham University Press, Brigham Young University. And this has here, I have two works of Al-Ghazali, one of the most important philosophers in the Middle Ages, The Incoherence of the Philosophers and the Niche of Light. And both of these books, you can see, they have they have some notes at the very end, discussion and the like, but in the main, it's just a bilingual text. And you have a very nice translation and a very nice, clear text. But I'm going to come back and talk about this text in a moment, because unfortunately, this Islamic Translation Series only has 14 volumes last time I checked. So it's not that extensive. There's a lot of things that you're going to want to read in this civilization if you are interested in going to its roots. Obviously, we're going to call it Islamic Civilization. You're going to want to read the Quran, the Noble Quran, which is not, you can't make it officially, it has to be read in Arabic. It has to be used in Arabic. But you can find some bilingual editions so you can get the meaning and understanding of it. And they often, as most of the ones that I've seen, for some reason, when they do that, I guess they're knowing you're not translating it for in any Muslim would be having it memorized in Arabic, so this must be for foreign scholars, so they put much more emphasis on the translation. These are full-blown translations with explanations and the like. Plus, the Arabic script is teeny tiny. It's really, really hard to read. So it behooves you to, if you're going to study the civilization, to get your Arabic reading skills up where you don't need that bilingual translation, because look how beautiful the Quran is when it's written out in full-sized letters, in full-sized text. So that's a very lovely thing to have. And then there's many other books from this civilization that are really worth reading. In a great books collection, I think maybe the one most important and exciting is the Muqaddimah of Ibn Khaldun. And this is a 13th century work. I believe it's generally considered to be the very first historiographical or sociological work. It's a total analysis of how society is structured and worked and everything like that. And it also shows many scholarly books of things like this look kind of like this. I don't know if you've studied or can read this script at all, but if you look at it, I'd invite you to notice just notice the way that it looks written on this page. There's not many paragraphs or periods or commas or anything. It is really a wall of text, but it's got all the vowels in it. Then there are some also really neat books to read from Islamic civilization that show the travels. This is the time period when Islamic civilization was at its flourishing. People went up. Here's Ibn Battuta and Ibn Jubayl, and these guys just traveled all over the world and wrote down everything that they saw and the different cultures and the like. So this edition does have some paragraphs and commas and periods and the like that a lot of texts don't have. If you're interested in great books of different civilizations, Al-Mustatarraf min kulli finni al-Mustadarraf is one of the most fascinating books I've ever encountered. This is a personal encyclopedia written by an Egyptian of the 14th century, and it is, I guess you could possibly translate it as something like the quest for achievement in all the arts and sciences. It is an attempt, if you want to talk about a Renaissance man, somebody who's like Leonardo da Vinci, can do everything, this guy was it. And this is a book how to do the best in poetry, the best in medicine, the best in everything. Everything, this is the sort of the height, or maybe this is when this civilization is at its peak. And this guy is saying, okay, I want to know everything. I want to be the best at everything that I can. What's the best way to write, the best way to study, the best way to look at the stars. So this is a personal encyclopedia about everything that was known in Islamic civilization in the 14th century and how you can achieve it or access it yourself. So this is a wonderful book. And then there is Kalila wa Dimna. This is a collection of tales that are allegorical and very rich, and you can really see the beautiful publication, some of the artwork that you get with it, and the script and everything. So I'm going to hold this up to just make a point. If anybody can read Arabic script, if you notice from all of these scholarly editions of great books from this culture that are published in this culture for people from this culture, what do you notice about this text compared to this text? We have got it into our heads that Arabic is written without vowels for adults. That might be true of newspapers and popular novels, but it's not true of scholarly books. Scholarly books, all of these books, have all the vowels written in, and that makes reading them much easier. These people at Brigham Young University have gone and put in periods and commas and paragraphs, but they've taken out the vowels. It'd be really nice if they would put them back in, if anybody's listening. Okay, that is some Arabic books to look at. And now let's look at some Persian books, because Persian is also one of the second, like we have Latin and Greek as our fundamental languages. They have Persian and Arabic. And so for Persian, you have also, you can find lots of nice editions that are sort of similar to the Brigham Young University. This is published by some Mazda publishers. It's not a university press, but it certainly looks like one. And this is similar to the Brigham Young books. This is, you get nice bilingual text of scholarly things that could be considered in great books traditions. This is a book of philosophy, the Book of Radiance, and what's called the Illumination tradition of medieval Persia. And so you have a nice edition with no footnotes or anything, but both languages side by side to facilitate your understanding of it. It's not hard to find bilingual texts for Persian literature either. You have some of the one of the greatest Persian authors or thinkers was Sa'di, and he wrote two main books, the Bustan, or the garden, and the Gulistan, or the rose garden. And this is more of a text that you can get both of them also in bilingual texts. So you have both versions here. There's also, and this you can also get on CD-ROM, or the reading of the poetry for this. And so Sa'di is a very deep thinker who just sort of talks about traveling around and seeing how life is lived, and morals and morality and all of these kind of things. You have a lot of poetry. You have the selected poems from the Divani Shams-e Tabriz. Again, just basic bilingual textual editions. Rumi's poetry, basic bilingual text editions. The greatest poem in Persian is the Shahnameh. The complete version here is how many thousands of pages, I don't know. But this Shahnameh is a wonderful, fantastic, epic poem that can really compare with Virgil's Aeneid or Homer's Odyssey or anything like that. But we do know the author, and there's some fascinating things about it, is that this was written about 200 years after the Arabic conquest of Iran, when Persian had been flooded with Arabic vocabulary, but he made the decision to write this entire book without Arabic vocabulary. So this is pure Persian, as it were. And also, this is written in the Islamic period, so maybe about the year 700, 800 of our reckoning. And the Zoroastrian heroes are long gone. The memory of them is long gone. But that's encapsulated in this. This is written in the form of epic poetry, heroic poetry, but there's a strong base of Zoroastrian mythology in this here too. So this you can get in some, this has been translated into many things. We could certainly look at this in any great books of Eastern civilization, and is also available in various sort of bilingual editions, excerpts of it, parts of this. And there are a lot of things, though, that are not available from Persian in any edition that I've ever seen. You have things, this whole series published in Iran for Iranian classics. And you have things like the Siyasinameh. This is the book of, this is maybe the equivalent of something like Machiavelli or Hobbes. It's a political treatise about rulers of the time when the Persians ruled everywhere from the Mughal Empire all into India and everywhere. And then this is the Iskandarnameh, and there's a whole tradition of books about Alexander the Great and epics about him, and obviously he was, well, he conquered them. He was the bad guy for them, but there's also a hero. They look at that. And what I find fascinating is I think that this was originally written in the several versions of this, but I think this is written maybe in the 12th century in Persia, at the same time that this, Le Roman d'Alexandre, was written in France. So I've always thought that that would be a fascinating thing, would be to compare and contrast these two novels or epics about Alexander the Great that were written from two cultures so far apart at about the same time. So that was a tour of some of the books in my library that I have from these other three civilizations that comprise or have books that we can consider great books that we might read in a similar way that we were to read this great books of the West. However difficult it is to read these books, reading these books is probably harder. However fascinating these are, however interesting they are to you, these books are, you just have, it's a complicated global world. There's all sorts of third culture kids out there, people who've grown up in one civilization, brought up in another. There's different, I mean, you could have been, your parents could have raised you in a Hare Krishna commune, for all I know, and then yes, the Bhagavad Gita will resonate with you more than the Bible does. But in the main, if you are an American, and most of my audience is, or if you're anywhere from North or South America or Europe, you're from this civilization. And even if you haven't dug into these texts yet, when you do, you will find that you have resonance with them that you kind of don't have with these. If you're from this civilization and you are religious, you are probably, very highly likely, you're Christian. And if you're not religious and you're from this civilization, what you are is, you might just call it not religious, atheist, humanistic, but in point of fact, what you are is, you are not Christian. You still have, when you dig into this, you realize you still have categories in your head for God, sin, heaven, hell, predestined. They might be very blurry, they might be turned off, they might not be activated in any sense, but you got them somewhere in there compared to ideas about karma, the gods, Godhead, reincarnation. Yet you probably don't have categories in your head for thinking about that. If you're American, you almost certainly believe that you should have some basic human rights, including the right to vote and choose your government. And you might think that that's a basic, given, common sense thing that everybody would know and agree with. But in point of fact, that is a very new idea. You won't find it in any of these books from the great civilizations of other civilizations. You won't find it, well, you might find a little bit in talking about Plato's Republic and other discussion of ancient Athens, and if you go further and know something about medieval Iceland, you might find some things there. But basically the whole idea of political liberty and ability to choose your leaders in government is a product of the last 300 years. So you can really go through and read this text sort of backwards. You'll find that crystallized in this volume here of the American State Papers, but that was written, predicated upon basically what Montesquieu and Rousseau wrote, which was based upon what Locke had to say about liberty and the like. And that was written in reaction to what Machiavelli and Hobbes had to say about the divine right of kings, which is based upon Augustine's notion of the city of God, which again does go back to Plato and Aristotle and their discussion of politics. So when you start reading these books, however much it cracks your brain and you have to scratch your head to figure them out, you will start to realize that there's resonance and things like that going around. When you read Marx, okay, you're going to read Marx Capital here and the Communist Manifesto. I mean, you might not be able to put your fingers on it right now, but yeah, we live in a world where in the past century, there was a very strong effort to have overt Marxist political and economic systems set up, communism as an active system. And maybe that has seemed to have gone away, but there's still covert communism in many ways. There's what we might call cultural Marxism is everywhere. And when you read this, you'll see that, you'll resonate with that, you'll understand that, you'll be able to identify it and talk about it on a deeper level. Whereas with these books, you probably will not have that ability to resonate with them as well, to see them, to find things like that. But again, I don't know. There are people from all over the world who are involved in different kinds of life experiences. So perhaps you will. That's not to say that these books are incomprehensible. Certainly things like the Shahnameh are very enjoyable to read as such, and you can read particularly the Islamic philosophers, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, they're the commentators on Aristotle. They fit right into this tradition. There's no need to separate them. Except, I mean, you could read very well. You could take Avicenna, Ibn Sina, Ibn Rushd, and read them with Thomas Aquinas and the medieval philosophers, and read them with Aristotle. That fits quite nicely. There are ways to do it. So I guess I will close on that note, that I do think that as a general rule, it's probably a good idea if you can have the patience, this is a lifetime project, to say, well, let me go through the great books of the West, at least as a college curriculum, at least for some sort of program, at least one sort of reading, one set of things, before I move on to reading books from the East. That might be a wise idea, but if you are really, really interested and want to do one of these things, I don't think, because as I said, there's the sacred books of the East is a collection out there. It's not organized by these three different slaves. It's a hodgepodge of things from different areas. There isn't, if you're not resonating with the civilization and its growth, there's no need to do it chronologically. I am getting a lot of people writing to me with interest about doing something for great books of the East. And so if we do that, and I'm happy to explore that possibility, I guess the idea would be we'd form a cohort and then look at what we wanted to dig into. Because there's a lot of things that humankind has thought about and written about and left as a legacy for us to look at. I think maybe in a couple of 100 years, people are going to have a really hard time making a book like this. Maybe we'll come to great books of the world, great books of world civilizations. And people will be able to resonate with everything. That's kind of an exciting thought. So I hope this was interesting and useful to you, and I will talk to you again next week. Thank you.